The village of Nyos is in the northwest corner of Cameroon, Africa, and everyone in the village was asleep after a long day of chores and the last cooking fires died down. But around 9:30 that night, there was a deep rumble that sounded like thunder. There was no rain. Joseph was woken up by the sound, but he didn't hear anything else, so he went back to sleep. It wasn't until he woke up the next morning that he would realize what that sound really was. Joseph Naquain was a farmer who spent his days tending to his crops and checking on his small herd of goats. His life was routine, work followed the seasons, and his time at home was spent with his children and his wife. On August 21st, 1986, he was having dinner with his family, and his 10-year-old daughter was going on about the market in Wum, a town about 25 miles away. After dinner, the family went to bed and fell asleep quickly. Around 9:30 p.m., a low rumbling noise, like distant thunder, came from Lake Nyos, a deep crater lake not that far from the village. Joseph stirred in his sleep, his mind registering the sound, but not yet alarmed. The noise faded and he went back to sleep. What he didn't realize was a deadly force was awakening. A massive cloud of fog came from the lake and rolled silently down the valleys toward Nyos and nearby villages like Cha, Cam, and Sabam. The fog hugged the ground, creeping into homes, and quietly took lives with terrifying efficiency. Joseph woke up later, his body heavy, his breath shallowed in labor. He tried to talk, to call out to his wife, but his voice wasn't working. His pants were stained red as if splattered with honey, and his arms had strange wounds, small, raw lesions he couldn't explain. He was confused as he stumbled to his daughter's bed, hoping to wake her up, but he couldn't. Her body was curled up in bed, but she wasn't breathing. A cold dread washed over Joseph as he looked over and saw his wife and youngest child across the room, motionless. He began to panic, but his body refused to work. His legs felt like lead, his vision blurred. He managed to open up the door, hoping fresh air might help, but the village outside was eerily quiet. No dogs barked, no roosters crowed. The air carried a faint smell, like gunpowder or rotten eggs, though Joseph's mind could barely process it. He staggered back inside, falling to the floor near his daughter's bed, where he slipped into unconsciousness. For hours, he lay in a coma, the world around him silent and still. When Joseph woke up again, it was late afternoon on Friday, August 22nd. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the village. His body ached. His throat was raw, and his mind struggled to piece together the night before. He shakily stood up, calling out to his neighbors, but no one answered. Stepping outside, he saw a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The village of Nyos was a graveyard. Bodies lay where they had fallen, near cooking fires, in doorways, on paths leading out of the village. His neighbors, his friends, his extended family, all were gone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of flies, though there weren't many left, most having perished in the same invisible catastrophe. Joseph's heart was pounding as he stumbled through the village. Looking around, he saw the children he had watched grow up, elders he had respected, and friends lying on the ground. The animals were dead too. Goats and cattle lay in the field, their bodies bloated under the sun. The vibrant forest surrounding Nyos stood in stark contrast to the death that he saw. Joseph's mind was spinning, not able to fully grasp the scale of the loss. He felt like the world had ended, leaving him alone in a nightmare. Driven by instinct and desperation, Joseph decided he couldn't stay. Most of his family lived in Wum, and he clung to the hope that they at least might be safe. He grabbed his motorcycle, its engines one of the few sounds in the quiet village. A friend joined him, equally dazed and weak. Together they rode through Nyos, passing more scenes of devastation. Empty homes, abandoned market stalls, and bodies laying across the paths. The road to Wum stretched endlessly before them, each mile harder than the last. His body, still feeling the effects of the fog, trembled with exhaustion. He could barely speak, his voice reduced to a rasp, and his arms and legs felt like they might give at any moment. When they reached Wum, Joseph's condition worsened. He couldn't walk. His body was giving in to the toll of the fog and the trauma of what he had seen. He was taken to a hospital in Wum, where medical staff were already overwhelmed from survivors from Nyos and surrounding villages. Doctors noted respiratory problems, skin lesions, and weakness among the survivors, symptoms consistent with exposure to high concentrations of carbon dioxide. Joseph's lesions, like those of others, were initially mistaken for burns. Later studies suggested they were caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation during his coma. He lay in the hospital surrounded by others who had lost everything, their faces marked with grief and confusion. What happened in Nyos and the surrounding villages is not something that happens often. The only 2 events that have ever been recorded in history are in Cameroon. One in 1984, which took 37 lives, and the other was Lake Nyos, which took 1,700. So what exactly happened here? First, let's talk a little bit about geology. Lake Nyos is an explosion crater that formed when lava flow came into contact with groundwater around 12,000 years ago. The area has been volcanically active for millions of years, and it also sits on a fault line that extends through Cameroon. Lake Nyos, along with 2 other lakes in the region, sit on a pool of magma that is still deep beneath the surface. And these 3 lakes are the only lakes in the world known to be saturated with carbon dioxide. I think you see where I'm going with this, but lakes that are deep or situated near volcanic activity have the ability to accumulate high levels of carbon dioxide, the same thing that we exhale. The gas enters the lake from multiple different sources. First, if you have a volcano nearby, the gases get stuck underground and have nowhere to go, so they burrow and find their way out of the contained area in any way they can. Because the molten lava of the volcano is so deep, they often find exits at the bottom of a deep lake. This is the main reason for the high levels of CO2 in Lake Nyos. Even though volcanic activity is the main cause for saturation of the water, you can't discount the other ways that CO2 gets into lakes. They're at least contributing factors. But they do happen in all water bodies around the world, and not all lakes are saturated. CO2 in the air can mix with water, but for this to happen, the water has to have lower levels of CO2 than the air before any will dissolve. So even though this happens continually, you need a large source of water to absorb a large amount of CO2. Winds that cause waves or even ripples generate more surface area that comes into contact with the air, allowing more chances for CO2 to dissolve. Then you have the decomposing matter at the bottom of the lake. As plant and animal life are broken down by microorganisms, they release CO2. This CO2 is then dissolved into the water, or in shallow lakes, it can be released to the surface as bubbles. And the last way is groundwater and surface runoff. As groundwater moves through the soil and surface runoff moves on top of the ground, they dissolve CO2 from decaying organic matter, and when it reaches the lake, it all mixes together, increasing the CO2 levels of the lake water. In deep lakes, the pressure and temperature of the water keeps the CO2 from just rising to the surface and being released into the air. The higher the pressure and the colder the water, the more CO2 that can dissolve into the water. So when you have really deep lakes like Nyos, which is 682 feet deep, that's about 296 psi of pressure. That's equivalent to the pressure in about 19 pressure cookers. All of this pressure from the weight and temperature of the water causes a pressure difference in the lake, which is called stratification. This layering keeps most of the CO2 trapped in the deeper waters. For it to be released, something outside of the water needs to interact with it to force it to the surface. This is usually a landslide or volcanic activity. In the case of Lake Nyos, they believe a landslide is what triggered the CO2-rich water to be forced upwards. That rumble that Joseph heard could have been the landslide or the large amount of water moving from the depths to the surface, or both. Once the CO2 reaches the surface, it rushes into the less saturated air, but with so much coming out at once, it doesn't dissolve. This is called a limnic eruption. The gas clings to the ground because it's heavier than air, like 1.5 times heavier. In Lake Nyos, the CO2 traveled like a fog down the side of the lake and into the surrounding villages. Anything in its path that needs oxygen was suffocated. When we inhale CO2, which we do every day at low levels, nothing really happens. But when the levels are high, confusion, dizziness, and headaches occur. These are the more common symptoms that are seen in indoor environments with high levels of CO2. For reference, OSHA says the PEL, or permissible exposure limit, which is the maximum level at which OSHA says you can be exposed to a substance. For carbon dioxide, that number is 5,000 parts per million inside of a building, which is hard to reach, even in busy places like classrooms due to windows and ventilation. When you're outside, the normal levels of CO2 are around 300 to 500 parts per million, depending on how close to heavy traffic you take your measurements. If you're standing next to a highway, your CO2 levels are going to be higher than if you're standing in a park. When Lake Nyos erupted, it's estimated to have released 1.2 billion cubic meters of CO2 at a single time. To put the right image in your head, imagine a box filled with gas in your backyard that's a quarter mile long, a quarter mile wide, and a quarter mile high. And this cloud traveled from the lake to the villages at 62 miles per hour. As it traveled, it displaced all of the breathable air around and led to suffocation, coma, and death of everything in its path. Bugs, livestock, forest creatures, you get the gist. For the villagers who were asleep, some may have noticed a bit of trouble breathing, but most of them likely slipped into a coma before they even knew what happened. As the CO2 levels were so high, they didn't stay in the coma for long before they passed. Our bodies handle CO2 every day, and with every breath we take. Our lungs and our blood regulate the amount within our bodies, but when it's the only available thing to inhale, it becomes toxic. The saying, "the dose makes the poison," comes to mind in this situation. The lungs can't get enough oxygen, so breathing is reduced. The blood becomes saturated, and the lack of oxygen causes our brains to shut down. The one weird thing that was noted in the Lake Nyos event that's never been reported with other people who have had carbon dioxide poisoning is the blisters. Typically, the way that carbon dioxide causes blisters is from touching dry ice, which is just solid CO2. When in the gas form, CO2 isn't known to cause burns, but all of the people from Lake Nyos area exhibited them. Their skin was red and blistered from the exposure to such high levels of CO2. No one knows why though. To prevent a disaster like this from happening again in the future, the Cameroonian government installed degassing pipes into the bottom of Lake Nyos and the other two highly saturated lakes, which allow the CO2 to rise and escape from the depths of the water. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and if you have any ideas on what you want to see next where I can break down the science behind history, leave that in the comments below and I'll make sure to make that video for you. See you guys next time.